Hello and welcome to day two of the Town Hall Summit. I think you will agree day one was fantastic. If you missed it and you're joining us for day two, you missed an amazing day of wonderful, wonderful, wonderful conversations, but you'll be able to see them on the replay. But today, we have another amazing lineup for you. We're going to be having, again, some really interesting conversations. We have really great folks joining us from all around the globe, starting with my friend who's here with me today, who's going to open this fireside chat with me, Beverly Israely from PJT Partners. Beverly is a managing director and looks after recruitment at PJT. So I welcome you, Beverly. I'm so glad to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's always a complete treat to be with you, India. Thank you.
Oh, it's a complete treat for me too. So there's a lot for us to talk about. I think the last year has really changed the way that we look at a number of what have traditionally been seen as human resources functions. And so I'm keen, obviously, on the recruitment part, but your view more broadly as well. So I'd really just kind of want to jump into and talk about strategy and how it's always evolving, especially in this time of uncertainty, and some of the ways that organizations can begin to think about what to do. Because everybody's kind of like, what do we do? How do we do this? How do we ensure we're getting the best possible outcome for our staff, for our clients, for our colleagues? What to do? I'd love to hear your take on what you did at PJT and what you're thinking.
Right, and for us, it's constantly evolving, and it's really the two things I think about most when I think about when we're thinking about recruiting diverse talent here is attention and intention, and that's sort of paying attention to the things we need to be paying attention to, and then focusing with intention on how to maybe change behaviors and how to make progress. PJT Partners is a boutique investment bank. We are in the business of giving advice. We don't move money. We don't make widgets. All we have is our people, and it's really important for us to be able to recruit from the widest possible pool of talent, which means everybody. And so that has really been super important to us in how we're thinking about growing the firm, because we're about 6 years old and we're growing, and we had early successes on the diversity front around gender, which I think is pretty relatively typical in the investment banking industry when there have been discussions around diversity. And India, you know this from your experience, the tendency has been around to focus on gender diversity, partially because it's easier. And we are fortunate here at PJT that we have a number of very senior women at the firm who are helping drive the growth of the firm. So, and obviously representation matters. So we had early success around gender, and then a couple of years ago started to widen the lens beyond gender to look at race. And I think there was this idea, of some people that like, we want to be colorblind and we just want the best talent. And then I think a lot of people's eyes were opened last year after George Floyd was murdered about like, maybe it's not just about being colorblind. Maybe we actually have to pay attention to color and think about it differently. And so we've been, there are a number of different things we have done around recruiting that are, I think, are pretty concrete, that I think are transferable to almost any organization. Number one, it's looking at who's on the interview slate. It's looking at who and are those people, and that doesn't mean that everybody on the interview slate has to bring some kind of diversity away from the majority of white men, but it's how aware are they of their unconscious bias walking into that room. Who's in the debrief, who's talking, who's got the loudest voice in the debrief, and does that sometimes quiet other voices that may have a dissenting opinion, and being able to have those conversations and look for consensus, but maybe push a little bit in those moments. We also use an artificial intelligence tool with our campus recruiting, and we use that because of the prevalence of like me bias in this industry, which is, you're given a stack of resumes and you look for the person who looks like you and who played on the, in the same, who was in the same fraternity and played the same sports as you. And, you're successful. So they're probably going to be successful. So it's again, sort of pointing out that like me bias, but using the AI tool helps us in the recruiting group to say, hey, we've got these candidates who scored really well and it looks like they would be successful on our platform, but you didn't choose them. And, they bring some diversity to the table. So, so those are a couple of very concrete things that that we've been doing that I think anyone can do, really.
So no, I mean, the things that you're saying, like operationally, it's that those are the things that people are struggling with. Like what do we do operationally? So that's a really interesting in terms of the recruiting process, thinking of it that way. I mean, the AI tool is kind of a really interesting piece. But when people are coming in, like, so how do you prepare for when you're bringing that talent in the door? Like, how do you decide like what group they'll go to? Is there that, do you apply some of that to that as well?
Absolutely. And the other thing that's really critically important is we can talk about recruiting all day long, but without thinking about what happens once we hire somebody and what their experience is like, all the great recruiting tools in the world are irrelevant, right? Because we've got to make sure, the firm has to make sure that everybody's set up for success, but we can't pretend that it's going to be the same experience for example, a Black person walking into an investment bank where there aren't so many Black people. So I think that it's really important to think about what that looks like. And that means, so again, some tangible things, some concrete things people can do. It's thinking about staffing. Okay, what deals is somebody going to be staffed on? Who else is on the deal team? For their first deal, should it be with this person or that person? Somebody could ask the question like, well, why would you treat somebody differently? And it's like, well, when we have more representation here, we can talk about that. But right now, and this is not just coming from me. This is in conversation with our Black colleagues about, okay, do we have to call it out? Yeah, we have to call it out, and it has to maybe be a little bit different. Is that the case for every single person? No, of course not. But when we have new employees, let's make sure everybody's set up for success. And I think that means mentorship, but also sponsorship. And mentorship, I think everybody understands that's really important for anybody young in their career and even older in their career. And the sponsorship piece is who's in the room when you're not in the room, and who's got your back, and who's looking after your career, and who's the person saying to the staffing manager, is that really the best choice? That didn't go so well last time, or that went really well. Let's try something else. So it's that mentorship, sponsorship, both of those things I think are really important. And again, anybody can do that. And then the other really important thing I think is feedback. And I think this is true also for women in this industry in particular. I don't want to give feedback because I don't want her to get upset. So keep falling behind and behind and behind. And there's a senior woman here who advises all women she meets to get staffed up on technical assignments early so that nobody can, because again, in this industry, there's this idea that women aren't technical the way that men are. And so her advice to women starting out in their careers, get staffed on those technical assignments. So it's that kind of thing. And delivering feedback is really important, making sure that feedback is given often. So you don't get to a point where it's like, well, so-and-so isn't really performing. Well, did they get that feedback? No. So those kinds of things seems kind of obvious maybe, but I think it's really important to make sure all of that's happening.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and it's really interesting because we're now with kind of this hypersensitivity and increased focus on race, particularly, it's hard. Like we've not been able to have these conversations about race societally for 400 years. We're now, it kind of landed in our laps and we're like, let's talk about it, and it's hard for people. And so, it's hard for people to think about what to say, how to say it. And so I can imagine that now, even more so, without the toolkit, people are like, how do I have these conversations? How do I give somebody feedback against the backdrop of what we've been experiencing over the last year? Which kind of brings me to, what did you do first? Like when you think about PJT and like George Floyd was murdered, it happens, suddenly the conversations about race around the table. There's this demand from the population that we want something to be done, versus an organizational constraints that are just organizational constraints no matter where you are. So what did PJT do first as the conversations about race emerged as in ways that it hadn't before?
Sure. So, I mean, it started at the top. I mean, our CEO is somebody who cares about this issue, and he sent out a really personal note to everybody at the firm. There were a lot of conversations between management and our Black employees, and reaching out, and so that's sort of what happened first. I mean, I think, like a lot of other organizations, it became okay to talk about this at work, where I know we had been trying to have these conversations before that happened. And then all of a sudden it's like, we can't not be talking about this. We can't pretend this doesn't exist, that we don't have issues, and that we don't have to do things a little bit differently and think about things a little bit differently. I think that, and of course, PJT and this industry, is not alone in being able to open up the conversations. And, and we've had some conversations here over the last year plus, and moments of real discomfort. And I feel like when those happen, that's when we make progress. And that's when I feel the most hope, is when I get into conversations with some of our white colleagues on this topic. And it's like, okay, this is going to be uncomfortable, and we're going to go there. And it feels like in all those conversations, we've come out on the right side of it. And I think just the more we can do that, the better it's going to be for everybody. And by the way, for everybody,
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting in that, because it's some of the experience I've had anyway, is what about meism? Like, so what does this mean for me? And I think that's a natural response for people to have. It's a natural response for people to wonder, like, what will this mean for me? Does it mean something different for me than it meant before in terms of my potential path, my opportunity? And I think, one of the things that I think about when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity and inclusion, as it has been for organizations over the last 25 or 30 years, is that I don't think that we did a good job of articulating what equity really means, that it's really meant to be equity for all, but that there are groups of folks that we need to focus on to get them up the curve. And I always tell this story about my children. And I always say, okay, so I have 3 children, 6 months old, 10 years old, and 12 years old. They're not really that age, but I'm just saying that for illustrative purposes. I wish I was still that young. But I'm going to have dinner with my kids. My 6-month-old, we're coming to have dinner, and I bring a high chair to the table for her. If I gave my 10-year-old and 12-year-old high chairs, how would they look at me? Because they don't need them. And so it's really about giving people what they need to be successful in that moment. It doesn't mean that my 10 and 12-year-old won't need something else at a different time. It means they don't need it right now, and that you're kind of making sure that the ones who can't get to the table are equipped to do that in that moment. And so, but we have never done a good job, in my experience, of talking to people about what that means. You know what I mean? It's kind of like we don't do that, and we didn't set that out. And when you don't, you get a lot of resistance in organizations, because everybody kind of wants to protect their patch, and you're doing that against the backdrop of protecting your patch. So, right. I mean, so my question is, you've had a lot of corporate experience. You've seen a lot over the course of your career. And in this moment, there's an impatience around the pace of change, right? So you have particularly younger generation folks who are like, we want change, we want it now, and then, there's the kind of organizational kind of barriers and structures that I alluded to before, which are not necessarily personal, but that exist, in large. How do you balance that? What are some of the barriers that people don't see that prevent change from
You know,
happening?
I think at a place where I used to work, which was a much bigger organization than the one I work at now, the CEO talks a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I remember when I worked there and I could see his direct reports, and they were all white men. And I thought, you keep saying this, but yet you're surrounded by people who look like you, likely have similar experiences in their career paths, likely aren't really thinking about things the way that somebody who maybe doesn't look like you and hasn't had your experience. So I think there's like a natural, it's not even resistance, it's just ignorance. And I don't mean that in like the negative kind of, it's like you just don't know what you don't know because everybody's got the same perspective. So I think at many large organizations, that's an issue. And I think that's another sort of concrete thing that can be done at organizations. I think other barriers include blind spots around unconscious bias. I think the prevalence of that like me bias that we talked about earlier is a huge hurdle. I think most people in this moment, in this country, at least, are thinking, yeah, I want it to be better. It should be better. I'm all for it being better. And yet they don't understand necessarily the history of why we are where we are today. And then, to your point about the zero-sum mentality. And if it gets better for others, is it going to get worse for me? And so when in fact, all data and all experience points to the fact that, racism costs everyone, not just people of color, right? So that it's really for the benefit of, I know as a white woman that, and I can talk a little bit about, India, you had asked me to reflect on my journey and kind of how I got here. And it's not something I ever really thought about articulating. But when I think about the intersection of my early life, I grew up in an intentionally diverse place. My mother moved us when I was in kindergarten to a community that was the first in New York State to implement voluntary busing. And so I grew up in a very racially, middle class, very racially diverse place. And that's all I knew until I graduated from high school. And I'm not saying it was perfect all the time. And my two closest friends were the two other white Jewish girls. So, but it was around me, that kind of diversity was around me in a way that it never has been since. And when I was back at my last reunion, the Black kids and the white kids, or I should say the middle-aged Black people and the middle-aged white people, were all saying that our lives have become increasingly segregated as we moved further away from that place and that time. And then, fast forward 15 years ago, when I found myself in the field of recruiting and feeling like so many people, there's something missing here. And why is this, particularly in this, I've been in financial services and investment banking in and around this space. It's, obviously not a pretty picture when it comes to racial diversity. So super lucky to be working at a firm that cares about this, where actually where we don't have a lot of historical cultural baggage at the firm to kind of unpack and get rid of. We're able to help build something a little bit differently, which is pretty cool. And I can talk a little bit about sort of the different ways we're doing that, which I think also are applicable to a lot of other organizations. And they're sort of, we talk about the top down and the bottoms up approach. So there are certain things that are kind of mandated from the top, like we have different recruiting programs that we support. We have as part of everybody's year-end review, there's a question around this topic. So there's stuff mandated from the top, business specific, et cetera. And then there's the bottoms up approach, which is when we have employees who want to um, who want to engage in this topic, how we can support them. So we've started a couple of employee resource groups here in lately, and that's a real partnership. So it's kind of there's two different ways of approaching it, and of course for every organization it's a little bit different. But I think it's also really important to listen and then listen some more. Because again, as a white woman, I can't speak to the experiences of my Black colleagues, but I can listen and try to, in my job as a recruiter, listen to the experiences that they've had earlier in their career as we're thinking about bringing in, trying to recruit a more diverse talent pool here.
Wow, there's so much I'd love to unpick. I wish I had another hour to do it because there's so many interesting things that you said there. And it's really interesting because I remember in I want to say it was maybe 2001 or 2002, I was working in an organization, and we were doing a lot of recruiting in India because we were opening an offshore center in India. And the person that I was working with, we were recruiting people to the site. So we had all the resumes come to us. I was in London at the time. We had all the resumes come to us, and we were going through all the resumes. And we were like, okay, let's go through. Here are the things we want to make sure of with people. And if they have those, we put them in this pile. If they don't, we put them in that pile. And I kept on I would look at some of when we discarded things. I just look at things just because I want to see what we discarded. And I was like, why did you discard this person? I was just kind of looking through them, and I was talking to this other person, and she was like, oh, I put the ones to the side where I couldn't pronounce the name. Honestly. And it's just that simple. Somebody's life can be changed, right? Somebody who's perfectly qualified has done everything they wanted to do. But it is really about our comfort with other people and other cultures. And one of the things that we've recognized that's really emerged over the last year is this competency that's emerging for leaders around culture. So cultural competency as one of the key indicators of a leader being ready to lead for really in a different way. And so, that was one thing you said that really shocked me. The other one that shocked me into thinking about it. The other thing is I was thinking when you were talking about what you were saying, like me, kind of that kind of like me bias. It's really interesting because it really does take such a tremendous amount of effort to break that. And I say that because when I was sitting in the last big seat that I had, I looked around and realized how many women were on my leadership team. Right? It happened so easily. Mm-hmm. So easily. And when you're in positions, and I'm saying of power, I'm using that loosely, but when you're in a position to be able to make those kinds of choices, you really have to check yourself. And I had to check myself. I was like, oh my gosh, I have of my 8 direct reports, 6 or 7 were women. And it didn't start out that way. Right. And so you have to be really thoughtful and careful. Mm-hmm. I think that's for anybody. It's a real intentional. You talked about attention versus intention. It's a very intentional thing. Very, very intentional. So just kind of, we have 5 minutes left. And I'd love to just hear a piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's coming through, a young person who's kind of coming through the ranks, trying to figure all of this out. We're really in tumultuous times. What do you tell somebody? What's the piece of advice that you would give them, or that maybe you even would have given yourself at their age?
I mean, I think the piece of advice I would give to somebody young, and this is advice I would give to my children if they would only listen to me or even have a conversation with me, is to find people who are different from you. Find people who don't share your experience and get to know them. And that goes in all ways. And I think it just, as we think about the kind of world we want to live in, and the kind of, in our case, the kind of firm we want to be is that kind of, inclusiveness and that kind of curiosity and openness. And, something I've heard you say many times is we all have way more in common than we don't. And to be thinking about that. And I know one thing you've taught me, India, in all of our conversations, because I can be very quick to judge. And you always remind me that everybody's experience is valid. And even if somebody disagrees with me, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be open to understanding where they're coming from and why they have experienced what they've experienced to bring to, give them that kind of perspective. So
I think that's great advice. Such good advice. And I love this part of the conversations because I can take things I can put in my pocket and walk away with them. So I was actually asking that for myself as much as I was for anybody who's listening. But Beverly, thank you so much for being here with me today. This has been wonderful. And I think, the nuggets that people will get from this. I think the key thing that I really wanted people to hear, having spent so much time with you and hearing about what you're doing, is that it can be done, right? That this stuff can be
Yes.
done. It takes some effort and sometimes it's hard, but it can be done. And so I just say thank you for sharing. And I don't know if you have any last words. If you do, I'd love to hear them. But otherwise, thank you. I just can only say thank you.
Thank you, India. It's always such a treat to be with you.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the day, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of the day, everybody. We are getting ready to move on to our next panel. Stay tuned. It's coming up. Thank you for joining me, Beverly. And I'll see you all in just a few moments.